Hi there, this is Stephen Green, and I'm here for MGST 703, assignment number 3. Here is my video submission. The working title for my essay is Leadership Approach Choice in Response to Socially Induced Change. The problem that I'm addressing with this essay is that leaders in large organizations, both private and public, face pressure from society to change organizational practice. This external pressure is often unrelated to the firm's core activities. So think about corporate social responsibility, forces from the past, or even modern day forces of increasing Indigenous engagement for resource extraction activities, or increasing workplace diversity through anti-racist hiring practices. These, I argue, are social political forces that are outside of a firm's core capabilities, core activities. And so my objective here is to explain how to minimize the resource use of firms and maximize the focus of the firm in response to these demands on a firm's attention and resources. While these forces try to shift focus and resources away from what it is the firm is responsible for, how can that be minimized? My main proposition is that when leaders choose to act decisively through policy action and clear tasks to accomplish goals related to the social political change, as opposed to choosing to act in a relational and consultative approach, they decrease the resources lost and distraction from core practices caused by the socially induced change. In order to make this claim, it's important to first understand the literature on institutional change. And there's a number of classical works, we've been exposed to a few already, on how institutions change, the forces, internal, external, that demand institutions change. So you need to have an understanding of that background. But there's also a lot of current research on corporate social responsibility that is kind of a statement on, well, how did organizations react to the change demanded through CSR, the demand for corporate social responsibility. And so that's kind of the background that's used to inform my approach. And the validation that I use to test my hypotheses is through an analysis of the annual reports of Alberta Health Services and an analysis of Canada Goose Incorporated's annual reports. And so we have kind of a public sector, large organization, and a recent newcomer to the private sector operating in the retail space to see, well, what are the choices that leaders face when responding to these socio-political pressures. So just to kind of clarify what it is I'm saying here, you have in society, you have a social political demand for change, right? And this can take a varied, I've used a few examples, but this social political demand for change exists out there external to the firm. Now, the leadership within a large organization has a choice. They can choose, and this is my independent variable here, how does a leadership's choice impact the resource use of a firm and the focus of a firm? And so I'm continuing a leadership dichotomy approach. Like, of course, leadership is a little more complex than this, but do they take a relational consultative leadership approach where you gather information from stakeholders? What do you think is the right way to do? How do you find this idea? I mean, I see this in Edmonton Public Schools, where we're looking at the approach to anti-racist initiatives, and our leadership tells us that, hey, what do you all think? Let's gather. I'll get back to you in 2023 to let you know what my decision is. And so is that an approach that should be taken? Or should the approach be more decisive? Like, this is our policy. This is how we're handling. This is our workplace diversity policy. This is how we're going to measure it. Now go. So both of these approaches will have an impact on the resources of a firm that's dedicated to the social political demand for change, or more accurately, that's dedicated to the core practices of the firm. Teaching kids to read, for instance. If managers are focused on solving this the problem of creating anti-racist institutions, then are they as focused on it's a resource exchange, right? And I'll argue in my hypothesis that the resource use of a firm on core capabilities goes down in the relational consultative leadership approach, whereas the resource use of a firm on core practices goes up if the leader just makes a decision. And likewise, the focus of the firm, how much focus and energy and thought is spent on issues that are really outside of what it is the firm is doing. So that is the basic structure of this. But there's also, and this goes back into my background, and the reason that I'm in this DBA is, well, how will this impact a firm performance? It's really tough to decide or to measure that, this leadership choice will have this impact on performance. And so that's why I'm focusing in on measuring these that I find are a little more easy to measure rather than a direct relationship to firm performance. But I do argue theoretically that it's there. Also, I think there's an impact and there's an assumption of this impact. I'm not going to measure it or argue that it can be measured. The social view of the firm, right? I mean, if you think of here's a social political demand for change, and a leader can do this, or it can do this, or it could down here, it could do nothing at all, just ignore the demand for change. And so what is that going to do to the social view of the firm and its position vis-a-vis its stakeholders, its customers, or its users? And so those things are there, and I say that they're there, but I am really focused on trying to measure these ones. So a little bit deeper into what it is I'm saying here. The background on institutionalism is very interesting. Institutional organizations, by Meyer and Rowan in 1977, Formal Structures, Myth and Ceremony, argue organizations are driven to incorporate the practices and procedures defined by prevailing rationalized concepts of organizational work and institutionalized in society. Organizations that do so increase their legitimacy and survival prospects, independent of the immediate efficacy of the acquired practices and procedures. And so what this is stating is that even though, and this is well documented in the scholarship, even though performance goes down, organizations can increase their legitimacy, right? Hannon and Freeman in 1977, The Population Ecology of Organizations, state that legitimacy constraints also emanate from the environment. Any legitimacy an organization has been able to generate constitutes an asset in manipulating the environment. To the extent that adaptation violates the legitimacy claims, it incurs considerable costs. So external legitimacy considerations also tend to limit adaptation. Basically, a firm is not able to do whatever it wants to. And when society is making a demand, firms need to respond to that demand in some way at the risk of losing legitimacy. There's current scholarship that's quite valuable on corporate sustainability efforts. So Saunderson and Weber talk about organizational structure from interaction, and they ask the question, why do some practices within a broad domain, such as sustainability, become enshrined in organizational structures, such as carbon dioxide reduction goals and reporting systems, while others do not? And then they admit that their model downplays the importance of executive leadership, which is my focus. Their work focuses on the internal processes through which organizations address social and environmental sustainability, and is building on the recognition of middle managers as important actors for pushing for sustainable initiatives from the bottom up, whereas I'm focusing in on what do the leaders do to impact these change demands. I don't have it in there, I'm sorry. Gupta and Briscoe argue in 2020 as well in their Organizational Political Ideology and Corporate Openness to Social Activism. How can we understand that features of firms that make them more open or closed to social activism? So in their study, they address this question by introducing the notion that organizational political ideology can shape how firms respond to activist protests. And so they look at the political leanings of the entire firm, whether liberal, Democrat, or conservative Republican. The number of members that fall into each camp will determine the approach of the firm, or the response of the firm to these social demands, to what they call the activist protests. And so they have specific protest movements that they focus in on, and then look at how the ideology of the firm members impact the approach. Organizations make sense of various strategic and socio-political issues in light of the central tendency of the industry context in which they operate. And so really, again, these two articles focus on both the the middle managers, different people within the firm. This is the collective of people within the firm and the response, whereas I focus on leadership. Leaders in large organizations do not have the luxury of ignoring social and political pressure to change. Indeed, one role of the leader is to decide when a social and political issue must be acted upon. The posture of statesmanship may well be appropriate for many executives. Organizations that ignore legislative change can face penalties and censure, but the force of change on organizations can be felt by all producers and consumers involved within an organization, even without legislation. Leaders, however, cannot bend and change based on every wind of change that society presents. Leaders must take account of the environment, adapting to its limitations as well as to the opportunities, but we must beware of institutional surrender made in the name of organizational survival. And so Selznick here really shows that the leader's approach does have an important role to play. All right, even in larger institutions with many players, the leader's choices and their approach to leadership can make a big difference. A leader can impact organizational direction through their approach to leadership. In my proposition, I set up a diametrically opposed approach to leadership that is indeed, it's a simplified understanding of what a leader does. Kerr and Germier, 1978 study, Substitutes for Leadership, compartmentalized the role of leader into two categories. There are relationship-oriented, like the good feelings that relationship building leaders do. And there are task-oriented, so guidance leadership impacts. So I continue this categorization that they develop of the approaches to leadership by assuming that when faced with social and political forces for change, a leader can choose to build relationships and good feelings through deliberative consultation, or a leader can choose to act decisively and guide the organization through policy and goal emphasis. The choice to gather information and then act, or to act and then gather information, has an impact on organizational attention and hence organizational resources. The gathering of information involves agents, usually managers or consultants, deliberating with stakeholders to find out what they feel or think would be a good solution to a complex external force. This gathering of information consumes the time and attention of the managers involved and of the stakeholders that are being engaged. Additionally, this kind of information gathering, it has to come from a part of the leadership structure that will be paid attention to. And so that signals that, yes, this issue is important, but it also signals that this issue is more important or as important as the core capabilities, right? Thus shifting resources from the core capabilities of the firm to its response to the social political change demands. So my hypothesis is that when faced with complex issues of social and political change imperatives, an organization can choose to deliberate and engage stakeholders in the solution, or it can act quickly and decisively in response to these external forces. The leadership approach will have an impact on firm focus and on firm resources. My hypothesis is that when leaders act decisively, firm resources and focus dedicated to non-core activities will decrease, whereas when leaders act consultatively and delay decisive action, firm resources and focus dedicated to non-core activities will increase. And I'm not too sure what the end result of this is going to be, as that's the hypothesis I will test through my validation in the annual reports of Alberta Health Services and the analysis of Canada Goose annual reports. And so we'll see if that hypothesis holds, that does a leadership's actions actually have a noticeable impact on firm resources and firm focus? So that's what will be tested. My conclusion, though, is kind of the reason why I wrote this, and again, why I hinted why I'm in this program to begin with, and it falls under this radical structuralist view that, like, why bother writing this stuff, learning about this stuff, if you aren't going to ultimately recommend the right course of action? And so I really believe, and I think I have this argument from Ibram X. Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist, is that the relation when dealing with these complex social political demands, firms' choice, not only, as I'm seeking to explore in my hypothesis, has an impact on firm resources, but there's another impact that should be considered by leaders. So Ibram X. Kendi argues that we convince ourselves that we are doing something to solve the racial problem when we are really doing something to satisfy our feelings. So that's the relational approach. We're feeling good about it, we're talking about it, but is it doing anything? And he argues, no, the problems of inequity and injustice persist. Only policy change helps groups. What if we focused our human, he challenges us, our human and fiscal resources on changing power and policy to actually make society better, not just our feelings better? And so that is why we'll see if this hypothesis holds, but it also is a reason why this social view of the firm matters, right? Are we actually changing to make things better? And not only I conclude will firms where leaders act decisively and implement change through actionable and measurable tasks be able to focus more clearly on their core activities, they will also be implementing positive change that the free and rational thinkers of democratic societies demand and drive the institutional change of their industry in the right direction. And so again, that I can't measure, right? And so I will be able to hopefully have a measure of that, which is what my theory is built on. I appreciate any feedback that you can offer, and thanks for your time in watching.